My sister laughed across the dinner table and told my 19-year-old son he would never own a house, that kids who chose trade school instead of a 4-year degree were settling for a life of renting forever. And she said it with the specific, satisfied confidence of a woman who genuinely believed her own household represented the version of success mine could never reach. My name is Petra Langford, 41 years old, living outside Salt Lake City, Utah, and my son Caleb had just finished his 2nd year as an electrical apprentice, working full days on job sites and taking evening coursework toward his journeyman license. A path he'd chosen deliberately after watching 2 friends graduate college with considerable debt and no clear job prospects. My sister Ophelia, 3 years older than me, had built a comfortable life in a large house in a newer development across town, married to a mid-level pharmaceutical sales executive, and had spent years subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, positioning her own choices as the responsible, aspirational template our extended family should follow. "I'm just being realistic," Ophelia said, when I asked her evenly to explain exactly what she'd meant. "The market's impossible right now. Kids doing trade work, living paycheck to paycheck. I love Caleb, but I don't want him setting himself up for disappointment thinking homeownership is even realistic on that kind of income." Caleb, to his enormous credit, didn't argue with her at the table. He simply excused himself to help clear plates, and it was watching him do that, quietly absorbing an insult about his entire future with more grace than I felt in that moment myself, that made me start paying closer attention to something I'd noticed, but hadn't fully processed over the previous several months. Ophelia had been unusually vague, for several months, about specific details of her own household finances, deflecting questions about a planned kitchen renovation she'd mentioned enthusiastically at Christmas, but never seemed to actually schedule, and mentioning, on 2 separate occasions, that she and her husband Desmond were restructuring some investments in ways that felt oddly imprecise for 2 people who had always been specific, even boastful, about their financial planning in the past. I didn't investigate immediately. I want to be honest that my first instinct was simply protective anger on Caleb's behalf, rather than any calculated curiosity about my sister's finances. That changed 3 weeks later, when Caleb, working a service call for his apprenticeship program, mentioned offhand at dinner that he'd been sent to do emergency electrical panel work at a house 2 streets over from Ophelia's, and had noticed, parked in the driveway of a house matching my sister's general description of her own neighborhood, a moving truck with a name he recognized from a bank foreclosure notice he'd seen posted at another job site earlier that same month. I want to be clear that Caleb hadn't put together any connection to Ophelia specifically. It was an offhand, unrelated observation about foreclosure notices being more common lately in newer developments across the valley. But something about the timing, layered on top of months of Ophelia's vague financial deflections, settled into my mind with an uncomfortable, persistent weight. I called our mother the following week, carefully, indirectly, asking whether she'd heard anything about how Ophelia and Desmond were doing financially, and the hesitation in her voice told me considerably more than her actual words did. "They asked us for a loan 2 months ago," my mother finally admitted. $15,000 for what Ophelia called a short-term investment opportunity. "Your father and I gave it to them without asking too many questions, because Ophelia's always been so careful with money, and we didn't want to insult her by seeming suspicious." I sat with that information for several days before I understood, with a growing, uncomfortable certainty, that Ophelia's confident lecture about Caleb's supposedly unrealistic homeownership prospects had come from a woman who was, at that very moment, quietly struggling to keep her own home out of foreclosure. I didn't confront her directly, not yet. I understood, watching how carefully she'd constructed her family's image of stability over the years, that a direct emotional accusation would likely be met with denial and defensiveness rather than honesty. Instead, I reached out to Desmond's brother, my cousin-in-law Fitzgerald, who worked in commercial banking and had always been closer to Desmond than the rest of our extended family, asking, carefully and without accusation, whether he'd heard anything about how Ophelia and Desmond were managing since Desmond's sales territory had reportedly been restructured the previous year. Desmond's commission structure changed significantly when his territory got reorganized, Fitzgerald told me. His base pay dropped considerably, and I know they took out a home equity loan against their house about 8 months ago, ostensibly for renovations, though I never actually saw any renovation work happen. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, Petra, but you're asking like you already suspect something's wrong. Over the following 2 months, without ever directly confronting Ophelia, I pieced together a picture that reframed her dinner table confidence entirely. Desmond's income had dropped by nearly 40% following his territory restructuring. The couple had taken out a home equity loan they'd never disclosed to the rest of the family, used not for renovations, but to cover mounting monthly expenses that had quietly outpaced their reduced income for the better part of a year. The $15,000 loan from our parents, rather than funding any investment opportunity, had gone directly toward a missed mortgage payment they were desperately trying to avoid disclosing to the rest of the family, terrified of exactly the kind of judgment Ophelia had so casually leveled at my son's own financial future. I want to be honest about the complicated mixture of emotions I felt sitting with this full picture. Part of me, I won't pretend otherwise, felt a sharp, uncomfortable satisfaction, understanding that my sister's confident lecture about Caleb's unrealistic future had come from a place of genuine desperation she'd been too proud, or too frightened, to admit to anyone. But a larger part of me felt something closer to sadness, watching a family narrative of effortless success unravel into a much more human, much more frightened reality that Ophelia had clearly been carrying largely alone. I brought what I'd learned to Ophelia directly, 6 weeks after that dinner, not as an accusation, but as an offer of the kind of honest support I wished she'd felt safe enough to ask for in the first place. "Know about the home equity loan," I told her. Sitting across from her at her own kitchen table, the same table where I imagined she and Desmond had spent months quietly panicking over mounting bills neither of them had told anyone about. "I know about the $15,000 from Mom and Dad. I'm not here to judge you, Ophelia. I'm here because I think you've been carrying something enormous entirely alone, and I don't think you have to." She cried for a long time before she said anything at all, and when she finally spoke, the confident, slightly superior tone I'd grown so used to over the years was entirely gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest than I'd heard from my sister in years. "I couldn't tell anyone," she said. "Everyone's always seen us as the successful ones. I didn't know how to say we were 3 months from losing the house without feeling like I was destroying the entire story of who we were supposed to be. Want to tell you what happened over the following year, because I think it matters considerably more than the initial discovery. Ophelia and Desmond, once the truth was finally out in the open, worked with a financial counselor to restructure their debt, sold a second vehicle they'd been maintaining largely for appearances' sake, and Desmond eventually found a new sales position with a more stable base salary. They didn't lose their house, though it required nearly a full year of careful, humbling financial restructuring, considerably more difficult and considerably less comfortable than the confident image Ophelia had spent years projecting to the rest of us. Caleb, meanwhile, continued his apprenticeship with a determination that I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters as much to this story as anything involving Ophelia's finances. He completed his journeyman electrician certification 18 months after that dinner, took on additional weekend work rewiring older homes throughout our valley, and methodically saved every dollar he could toward a down payment, working with a credit union's first-time homebuyer program, specifically designed for exactly the kind of steady, skilled trade income he was building. He closed on a modest 3-bedroom starter home 11 months after his aunt's confident prediction that homeownership simply wasn't realistic for someone in his position. A small, unremarkable house on a quiet street that meant considerably more to him, I think, precisely because he'd built the path to it entirely through his own steady, unglamorous determination. I didn't gloat about it to Ophelia, and I want to be clear that I don't think this story is really about proving her wrong in some triumphant, cinematic sense. What I did do, the week Caleb closed on his house, was invite Ophelia and Desmond to the small housewarming gathering he held with a handful of friends and family, and I watched my sister walk through my son's first home with an expression that held considerably more genuine warmth than I might have expected, given everything that had happened between us over the previous year. I was wrong, she told him quietly, standing in his small, sparsely furnished living room. Not just about the house. About assuming I understood your path better than you did. Caleb, with the same quiet grace he'd shown at that original dinner table, simply told her that everyone's path looks different, and that he was glad she and Desmond had found their way through a difficult year too. I think, often, about the particular danger of confident public judgment aimed at someone else's future, especially when it comes from someone quietly struggling with the exact insecurity they're projecting outward onto others. Ophelia's laugh at that dinner table wasn't really about Caleb's realistic prospects at all. It was about a woman terrified that her own carefully constructed image of stability was crumbling, using someone else's supposedly unrealistic future as a way of reassuring herself that her own choices still represented the safer, smarter path. She was wrong about that, in ways considerably more complicated and more human than either of us could have fully understood sitting at that dinner table the night she laughed and told my son he'd never own a house of his own.